are mostly up to spec with regards to CSP 1.0 compliance, but if you happen to notice in the process of your testing for content security policy that you're seeing some unexpected behavior, there is a strong possibility that it may not necessarily be your content security policy. It could just be the client's browser acting like a smelly lobster. So let's talk a little bit more in detail about the inline JavaScript bit that I alluded to earlier. So as I mentioned, Content Security Policy 1.0 disallows by default the use of inline JavaScript on a page. This is actually, as it turns out, kind of a big deal. The way that is recommended to sort of deal with inline JavaScript is to create external scripts out of all your inline JavaScript. This has kind of a number of implications. The biggest one being that you're essentially turning all these inline bits of JavaScript into synchronous calls that the browser has to retrieve the JavaScript from. Alternatively, if you want to get around this, you can also specify as I mentioned before, the unsafe inline directive, but this has implications for defeating or basically weakening the strength of your content security policy. And in addition, if you use any kind of asynchronous JavaScript loading library such as require.js, this also has implications as well, because require.js and other asynchronous JavaScript loading libraries, what they like to do is they essentially like to say, hey, I want to load this bit of JavaScript, so at some point during the rendering of the page, I'm going to basically call it append child to the head of the document with the contents of the JavaScript. And because this is all done asynchronously, it's very fast. There's no additional HTTP call, but the problem is that that's going to cause issues with Content Security Policy 1.0. So as a result, there are potential performance implications to deploying CSP 1.0 by turning all of your scripts into externalized bits of JavaScript. Hopefully, Content Security Policy 1.1 will fix that, as right now they're sort of working out the final bits of the spec, but there will essentially be a way to safely whitelist inline JavaScript on the page. So let me talk about some real world implications about deploying a content security policy to your production website. So, oh my God, this is terrible. So there's a couple questions that a lot of you probably have if you're thinking about rolling out a content security policy to your website. For example, how should you go about rolling out a content security policy to your website? How should you test the validity of your content security policy? And what bits should you throw the content security policy onto? A number of websites such as Twitter, for example, have chosen to focus their content security policy on specific segments of their website. And this actually makes a lot of sense from a metric standpoint, because it gives you a very focused approach to applying and fixing the issues that your content security policy detects. So these are two just graphs of Splunk showing a hit count of content security policy violations that have been sent from client browsers using the report only directive to an endpoint that I've specified. And in addition, the bottom graph shows a list of top blocked URIs. So what's really powerful about content security policy is that if you specify a report only endpoint, you can use this to essentially learn all the things about content security policy violations that clients are seeing. And this potentially has some really interesting implications. In the process of looking into content security policy, during the evolution of the spec, one of the things that I noticed was the fact that you end up seeing a lot of mixed content on your website. And the nice thing about content security policy is that it's actually really effective at helping you root out and stamp out all those instances of mixed content on your website. So essentially the technique that one can use for detecting this mixed content on your website is if you specify a content security policy and you have a reporting endpoint, if you see the reporting endpoint, the browser essentially sends a JSON blob to the reporting endpoint containing information such as the document URI, the URI of the blocked element, what have you. And so basically, if you just parse this blob and detect if the scheme of the document scheme that was retrieved was HTTPS and the blocked URI was HTTP, then you have an instance of mixed content sitting on your website. Now granted, certain headers such as HTTP strict transport security can actually be an effective approach in essentially removing mixed content from your website, because this will force all your subdomains to HTTPS. But from an implementation standpoint, from experience, I've discovered that most of the issues that you will run into with mixed content on your website when rolling out a content security policy won't be from your own subdomain. Surprise, surprise. It'll actually be coming from, in most instances, third-party vendors who don't, for example, simply don't have an HTTPS endpoint for their website. So a couple additional thoughts about content security policy. As I mentioned before, unsafe inline and unsafe eval essentially severely nerf the protective abilities that content security policy give to you. So it's important when deploying a content security policy to consider whether or not you should include these directives in your policy. In addition, content security policy can, if you choose to implement it as a header, you can potentially be including a very, very large number of sources in your policy. And that can cause your header sizes to grow, which can potentially have an impact on performance. And the final, last sort of obvious point is that you should always make an effort to test your content security policy before you roll it out to production. So let me get to the the good bits before talking about the tool that I created. So if you want to test content security policy right now, live, it's a thing that exists in Firefox 23 and Chrome 25. Previous versions of this browser used, I believe, the X content security policy header for older versions of Firefox and the X WebKit CSP header for Chrome. And if you want, you can test this out. You can apply the report only header or as a meta tag to simply have the browser attempt to basically not block instances of bad JavaScript or style elements that it sees. In addition, the report URI is tremendously powerful from a metrics perspective, just because of the fact that it can give you so much information on what clients are actually potentially seeing in terms of blocked content. And with the ability to monitor all of this blocked content via either Splunk or StatsD or Graphite or some other logging metrics tool that you use, it gives you the ability to look into and fix all of your inline JavaScript issues that are caused by deploying a content security policy. All right, so let me talk a little bit more in depth about the tool that I'm releasing. So one problem that I initially ran into when deploying a content security policy was that it was actually really annoying to test my content security policy in a development environment and then push it to production, because of the very nature of the fact that in production I would have to specify prod hosts, and in dev, I would have to use dev hosts. And it was annoying to the point where I didn't want to have to constantly poison my host file to have to handle this. So I decided, F it, I'm going to make some tools to help me fix this problem. So CSP tools is essentially a set of 3 Python-based tools that do the following. The proxy tool is essentially a Python proxy written using libmproxy that intercepts all HTTP and HTTPS traffic. And what it will do if you connect to this proxy is it will dynamically insert a content security policy report